The champagne glasses caught the chandelier light as 40 guests raised a toast to Weston Caldbury Ash, golden son, heir apparent, the boy who could do no wrong. No one raised a glass to his brother. Thaddeus stood near the back wall of the ballroom in a suit that fit slightly wrong at the shoulders, watching his mother Cordelia beam at Weston like he'd personally hung the moon over Caldbury Manor. She hadn't looked at Thaddeus like that once in 23 years. To the future of Caldbury Industries, Cordelia announced, lifting her glass higher. To my son. My son. Not my sons. Never both. Thaddeus's father, Reginald, caught his eye briefly from across the room, a flicker of something like guilt, before turning back to the crowd, silent as always. It was Weston who finally said it out loud, drunk on champagne and adoration, loud enough for the whole room to hear. Let's be honest, Weston laughed. Raising his glass toward his brother, Thaddeus was always the backup plan. The mistake that turned into a tax write-off. No offense, bro. The room tittered with uncomfortable laughter. Cordelia didn't correct him. Thaddeus set down his glass, untouched, and smiled the way he'd taught himself to smile through worse. None taken, he said quietly. What none of them knew, not Weston, not Cordelia, not even his own father, was that 2 hours before this party started, Thaddeus had sat in a lawyer's office and signed away every cent of his future inheritance, quietly transferring it into Caldbury Industries to stop the company's creditors from seizing it by morning. He hadn't done it for recognition. He'd done it so the family calling him a mistake would still have a company to inherit it all. Caldbury Manor had thrown parties like this 100 times before, chandeliers blazing, string quartet tucked into the corner, waitstaff circling with silver trays of hors d'oeuvres that cost more per plate than most people's weekly groceries. Thaddeus had grown up in rooms exactly like this one, and yet he'd never once stopped feeling like a guest in his own home. Tonight's party was in honor of Weston's official appointment as Chief Operating Officer of Caldbury Industries, a title that, as far as Thaddeus understood, existed mostly on paper. Weston had never run a department, never closed a deal, never sat through a single earnings call without checking his phone under the table. But he had Cordelia's smile and Reginald's last name spoken with total conviction, and in the Caldbury family, that had always been enough. Thaddeus, 26, had been working for the company for 4 years, unpaid internship turned junior analyst, turned the guy who quietly fixed problems no one else noticed until they became disasters. He didn't have a title, people announced at parties. He had spreadsheets, late nights, a corner office nobody visited. He stood near the back wall now, watching his mother straighten Weston's tie in front of 40 guests like he was a child on his first day of school. Not a 28-year-old man who'd been fired from 2 previous companies for reasons the family never discussed out loud. Doesn't he look sharp? Cordelia said to a cluster of admiring guests, her diamond earrings catching the light. My son has always had that natural presence, that magnetic quality. Some people are simply born to lead. No one mentioned that Thaddeus had spent the last 6 weeks quietly restructuring the shipping division's entire logistics contract, saving the company nearly $2 million, a fact buried in a report Cordelia had likely never opened. Thaddeus caught his father's eye across the room. Reginald Caldbury Ash, 71, silver-haired and perpetually exhausted, looking in the way of men who'd spent their entire lives building something they secretly feared collapsing, offered him a small, apologetic nod. It was the same nod he'd been giving Thaddeus for 23 years, acknowledgement without action, sympathy without defense. Reginald had been the one to insist on the adoption in the first place, back when Cordelia was recovering from a difficult near-fatal delivery with Weston and doctors had warned her that a second pregnancy could be dangerous. He'd wanted another child. He'd chosen Thaddeus specifically, driven 3 hours to a small agency upstate, and brought home a 6-month-old boy with an unusual calm about him, even as an infant. But somewhere in the years since, Reginald had gone quiet, retreated into boardrooms and business trips, leaving Cordelia's favoritism to calcify into something unspoken but absolute. He never openly agreed with the way she treated Weston versus Thaddeus. He also never once stopped it. Thaddeus had stopped waiting for him to. You look like you're plotting something, said a voice beside him. He turned to find Ingrid Halvorsen, the family's longtime attorney, holding a glass of untouched champagne, her sharp eyes studying the room with the same careful attention she brought to every contract she'd ever drafted. Just observing, Thaddeus said. You're very good at that, Ingrid said. Observing. Quietly fixing things nobody thanks you for. She paused, glancing toward the paperwork thin smile Thaddeus had been wearing all evening. How did this afternoon's meeting go? Thaddeus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. As expected. Ingrid had been the one to walk him through the paperwork 3 hours earlier, in a quiet conference room 2 floors below the party currently unfolding above them. She'd watched him sign document after document the full transfer of his inheritance trust, established by his grandfather decades ago and meant to pass to him on his 30th birthday, redirected instead into an emergency capital infusion for Caldberry Industries. You understand, Ingrid had said carefully, sliding the final page toward him, that once this is signed, it's irreversible. Your entire trust, nearly $40 million, goes directly to the company's creditors by morning. You'll have nothing left. No safety net. Nothing. I understand, Thaddeus had said, signing without hesitation. The board doesn't know yet. Your parents don't know yet. Weston certainly doesn't know. Ingrid had studied him carefully. Why are you doing this, Thaddeus? You could let the company face its creditors. You could let your father figure this out on his own. No one would blame you. Thaddeus had set the pen down slowly. Staring at his own signature the first time in his life, he realized that his name on a document actually mattered to anyone but himself. Because it's not just my father's company, he'd said quietly. It's the reason 400 employees still have jobs tomorrow morning. My family's approval was never really the point, Ingrid. It never really was. Now, standing in the ballroom watching Weston hold court in the center of the room, champagne in hand, oblivious to the fact that his newly appointed COO title existed above a company that had been 6 hours away from bankruptcy that very afternoon. Thaddeus felt strangely, impossibly calm. He hadn't told anyone. Not his mother, not his father, certainly not Weston. Ingrid had assured him the paperwork would remain confidential until the board's emergency session Monday morning meeting. For now, at this party, in this room full of people toasting the wrong son, Thaddeus was simply invisible. Exactly as always. To the future of Caldberry Industries, Cordelia announced suddenly, raising her glass higher, silencing the room's chatter. To my son. The words landed exactly the way they always did, a soft, precise wound Thaddeus had learned to absorb without flinching. My son. Singular. Never both. Not once. Not in 23 years. Had Cordelia introduced them as my sons in the same sentence without some qualifier trailing behind Thaddeus's name, my adopted son. As if the word required an asterisk, a footnote, a small clarification that he wasn't quite the real thing. He raised his own glass along with the rest of the room, the champagne untouched against his lips, his eyes drifting toward his father, who was staring down at his own drink instead of his son's, unable or unwilling to meet either of their eyes. It was Weston, flushed with champagne, and the particular arrogance of a man who'd never once had to earn anything he'd been given, who finally leaned toward Thaddeus with a lazy, careless grin and said the words that would echo through the rest of that night far louder than any toast. Let's be honest, Weston said, loud enough for the cluster of nearby guests to hear, raising his glass toward his brother with the lazy confidence of a man who'd never once considered the weight of his own words. Thaddeus was always the backup plan, the mistake that turned into a tax write-off. He laughed, nudging Thaddeus's shoulder. No offense, bro. The room tittered that particular brand of uncomfortable laughter rich people offered when they weren't quite sure whether something was a joke or a confession. A few guests glanced away, suddenly fascinated by their champagne flutes. Others watched Thaddeus directly, waiting to see how he'd react, the way people watch a car they suspect is about to crash. Cordelia didn't correct him. She didn't even flinch. She simply sipped her champagne, her attention already drifting toward the next cluster of guests waiting to congratulate Weston. Thaddeus set his glass down on a passing waiter's tray, untouched, and smiled the practiced, weathered smile he'd spent 23 years perfecting. None taken, he said quietly. But Ingrid, standing close enough to hear everything, felt something in her chest tighten at the sheer, casual cruelty of it, made worse by the fact that she, alone in that entire ballroom, knew exactly what Thaddeus had done that afternoon to keep the company Weston was busy congratulating himself over from collapsing entirely. Weston, Reginald's voice cut through the moment, sharp enough to startle a few nearby guests, though it came a beat too late to undo the damage already done. That's enough. Relax, Dad. I'm kidding, Weston said, waving a hand dismissively, already turning back toward the group of admirers waiting for his attention. Thaddeus knows I'm kidding. Right, bro? Thaddeus said nothing. He'd learned years ago that responding only extended these moments, gave them oxygen, turned a private humiliation into a public performance. Silence, he'd found, was the only weapon available to him in rooms like this. Cordelia finally turned, her expression somewhere between mild irritation and practiced diplomacy, not because Weston had said something cruel, Thaddeus realized, but because he'd said it loudly enough to be noticed. Weston, darling, perhaps save the jokes for later, she said, though her tone carried none of the sharpness she'd have used if Thaddeus had been the one making a scene. She turned toward the guests still watching. He's always been so playful. Brothers, you know how it is. Brothers. The word landed strangely in Thaddeus's chest the first time all evening she'd acknowledged them as anything close to equals, and only in service of smoothing over her golden son's carelessness. Ingrid found Thaddeus 20 minutes later, standing alone on the manor's back terrace, city lights glittering faintly beyond the estate's manicured grounds. The muffled sounds of the party still drifting through the open doors behind them. You didn't have to just stand there and take that, she said, joining him at the railing. What was I supposed to do? Thaddeus asked, his voice quiet, controlled, though something raw flickered underneath it. Announce to the whole room that I signed away $40 million this afternoon to save the company he just got promoted to run? Make it about me? Maybe it should be about you, Ingrid said carefully. Just once. Thaddeus shook his head slowly. It was never about me, Ingrid. Not tonight. Not the last 23 years. He looked out at the skyline, jaw tight. I didn't sign that trust away for credit. I signed it because Monday morning, 400 employees are going to walk into offices that still exist because of a decision nobody in that ballroom knows I made. That's enough for me. Is it though? Ingrid pressed gently. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've spent your entire life saving people who don't even bother thanking you for it. Before Thaddeus could answer, the terrace door opened behind them, and Reginald stepped outside, closing it softly against the noise of the party. Thaddeus, his father said, his voice heavy, careful. Can we talk? There's nothing to talk about, Thaddeus said, not turning around. Weston made a joke. I'm fine, that's not what I want to discuss, Reginald said, moving to stand beside him at the railing, Ingrid quietly stepping back to give them space. I got a call an hour ago. From the board's emergency liaison. His voice dropped lower. Someone infused nearly $40 million into the company's capital reserves this afternoon. Enough to stop Monday's creditor seizure entirely. Thaddeus's stomach tightened, though his expression remained carefully neutral. The transaction came from a private trust. Reginald continued, studying his son's face now with an intensity Thaddeus hadn't seen from him in years. A trust established by my father, meant to transfer to you on your 30th birthday. He paused, his voice breaking slightly. Thaddeus, tell me that wasn't you. Ingrid, standing several feet away, said nothing, her eyes fixed carefully on the city lights, giving Thaddeus the space to decide, on his own terms, whether tonight would be the night the truth finally reached the rest of his family, or whether he'd let this secret stay buried, the way he'd buried so much else, for people who'd never once bothered to look for it. Thaddeus stared out at the skyline for a long moment before answering, the muffled bass line of the string quartet still drifting faintly through the terrace doors behind them. 40 guests inside laughing and toasting a company they had no idea had nearly ceased to exist 12 hours earlier. Yes, he said finally. It was me. Reginald's breath caught audibly. $40 million. Your entire trust. Gone, just like that. Not gone, Thaddeus said. Reinvested into the company that employs 400 people who had no idea, until this afternoon, how close they were to losing their jobs by Monday morning. Why didn't you come to me? Reginald's voice cracked, something raw finally breaking through decades of careful, controlled distance. Why would you make a decision like this alone, without even telling your own father? Thaddeus turned to face him fully now, 23 years of carefully swallowed words finally rising to the surface. Because every time I've tried to be part of this family's decisions, I've been reminded, one way or another, that my voice doesn't carry the same weight as Weston's. So I stopped trying to be heard, and I started just fixing things quietly instead. It's easier that way. No one gets to dismiss what they don't know about. The terrace door swung open again, and this time it was Cordelia, her champagne flute abandoned somewhere inside, her expression tight with the particular irritation of a hostess whose party had been disrupted. "Reginald, what on earth is taking so long? Weston's about to give his acceptance speech, and you're both hiding out here." Like she stopped abruptly, catching the tension radiating between her husband and her adopted son. "What's going on?" "Cordelia," Reginald said slowly, turning to face her. "Did you know the board almost seized company assets tomorrow morning? That Caldberry Industries was 6 hours away from creditor collapse this afternoon?" Cordelia blinked, genuinely caught off guard. "What are you talking about? The quarterly reports looked fine last month." "They weren't fine," Reginald said. "They haven't been fine for over a year. I've been quietly restructuring debt, taking out loans against the estate, trying to keep it from becoming public knowledge before Weston's promotion could be finalized." His voice grew heavier. "And this afternoon, someone stepped in and stopped the collapse entirely. Signed away nearly $40 million of their own inheritance to do it." Cordelia's eyes darted between her husband and Thaddeus, comprehension dawning slowly, painfully, across her face. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible." "It's possible," Thaddeus said quietly, "because it happened. I signed the paperwork this afternoon, 2 hours before your party started." Ingrid drew up the documents. He nodded toward the attorney, who remained silent near the terrace railing, offering no rescue, no interruption, simply a witness to a conversation that had been avoided for far too long. Cordelia's hand rose slowly to her mouth. "You gave away your entire trust. The one your grandfather set up for you specifically." Her voice wavered. "Why would you do that?" After everything, she stopped herself, unable to finish the sentence, though everyone standing on that terrace understood exactly what she'd almost said. "After everything we've put you through. After everything I've made you feel, every single day of your life in this family." "Because it was never about the money for me," Thaddeus said, his voice steady despite the ache beneath it. "It was about the 400 employees who'd lose their jobs. About my father's company, the one he built from nothing, collapsing because nobody wanted to admit how bad things had actually gotten. It wasn't about being thanked. It wasn't about being noticed." He paused, his eyes flickering, just briefly, with something more vulnerable beneath the calm. "Though I'll admit, some small, stubborn part of me hoped that maybe, just once, doing something like this quietly would matter more than being called a mistake in front of 40 people. The terrace door opened a third time, and Weston stepped out, champagne flute still in hand, his expression shifting from confused to defensive the moment he registered the weight of the silence waiting for him. "What's everyone doing out here?" he asked, glancing between his parents and his brother. "I'm about to give my speech." "Mom, are you coming back inside or Weston?" Cordelia said, her voice unusually thin. "Did you know the company nearly collapsed today?" Weston's easy smile faltered. "What? No, what are you talking about?" "Your brother," Reginald said slowly, "gave away his entire inheritance this afternoon. $40 million, to save the company you were just promoted to help run." The color drained slowly from Weston's face, his champagne flute lowering inch by inch as the full weight of the moment finally settled over him. He looked at Thaddeus, really looked at him. Thaddeus realized, for what felt like the first time in years, searching his brother's face for some sign that this was an elaborate joke, a misunderstanding. Anything other than the truth standing plainly in front of him. "You're lying," Weston said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Why would you do that? Especially after He stopped, the memory of his own words inside the ballroom rushing back all at once, the word mistake hanging suddenly, unbearably heavy in the night air between them. "Especially after you just called me a tax write-off in front of 40 guests. Thaddeus finished for him, his voice quiet but unflinching. "Yeah, especially after that." Weston's mouth opened, then closed, no easy joke or careless deflection available to him this time. Inside the ballroom, the string quartet shifted into a new song, and somewhere beyond the terrace doors, 40 guests continued celebrating a promotion built entirely on a foundation none of them yet understood had almost crumbled, completely saved by the one son in the family they'd spent 23 years teaching everyone else to overlook. For a long moment, no one on the terrace spoke. The string quartet's new song drifted faintly through the glass doors, absurdly cheerful against the wreckage unfolding in the cool night air. Weston stood frozen, his champagne flute forgotten in his hand, the word mistake still hanging between him and his brother like something neither of them could take back. "Say something," Weston finally managed, his voice smaller than Thaddeus had ever heard it. "Thaddeus, please, say something. What do you want me to say?" Thaddeus asked, and for the first time all evening, exhaustion cracked through his composure. "That it's fine? That I'm used to it?" "Because I am used to it, Weston. That's the part that should actually bother you. 23 years, and I've gotten so used to being the family's afterthought that I didn't even flinch tonight when you called me a tax write-off in front of 40 people. I just smiled and said none taken. The way I always do. I didn't mean it like you did though," Thaddeus said, not unkindly, but without softening it either, maybe not maliciously. "But you meant it enough to say it out loud, in front of a room full of people, without thinking twice. That's not a slip of the tongue, Weston, that's a belief you've carried your whole life. One this family handed you without you ever having to question it." Cordelia had gone pale, one hand still pressed against her mouth, her carefully composed hostess mask entirely gone now, replaced by something rawer, more frightened. "Thaddeus, I never meant for you to feel you didn't have to mean it, Mother," Thaddeus said. And the word mother landed strangely between them. Formal in a way it hadn't been since he was a small child, still hoping the word might someday feel as natural coming from her as it clearly felt going toward Weston. "You just had to do it, over and over, for 23 years, until it became the water this entire family swims in without ever noticing. Every toast, every introduction, every time you said my son instead of my sons. You didn't have to mean any of it maliciously for it to still cost me something." Reginald stepped forward, his voice thick. "I should have said something, years ago, every time. I told myself I was keeping the peace, but I wasn't. I was just letting you carry all of it alone." "You were," Thaddeus agreed quietly. "But I didn't sign that trust away this afternoon to punish anyone. Or to finally earn an apology I've been waiting 23 years for. I did it because it was the right thing to do for 400 families who had nothing to do with any of this. What happens between the four of us tonight, that's a separate conversation entirely." Ingrid, who had remained silent through most of the exchange, finally spoke, her voice measured and careful. "There's something else you all should probably know before this conversation goes any further." Every eye on the terrace turned toward her. "The board's emergency session isn't just about accepting the capital infusion," Ingrid continued. "It's also about restructuring leadership responsibilities, given how close the company came to collapse under current management. Reginald, several board members have already raised concerns about Weston's readiness for the COO role, especially now that it's clear he had no visibility into the company's financial state at all." Weston's face went white. "They can't just take back my promotion because of one bad quarter. It wasn't one bad quarter," Reginald said heavily. "It was over a year of mismanagement I was too proud to admit, compounded by a promotion I pushed through because I wanted my son in a leadership position, regardless of whether he'd actually earned it." He turned to Thaddeus, something breaking open in his expression. "The board is going to want someone competent overseeing that reserve fund. Someone who actually understands the company's real financial position." Thaddeus felt the weight of every eye on the terrace shift toward him, and for the first time in 23 years, it didn't feel like disappointment. It felt like the truth. Finally, being seen. "I'm not doing this for a promotion," Thaddeus said carefully, though something in his chest tightened at the unfamiliar sensation of being considered at all. "I never wanted Weston's title. I never wanted to be handed anything just because I quietly cleaned up a mess nobody else saw coming. That's exactly why the board would trust you with it," Ingrid said gently. "Because you've spent 4 years proving you don't need the recognition to do the work well. That's rarer than you think, Thaddeus. Rarer than most people in that ballroom tonight will ever understand." Weston set his champagne flute down on the terrace railing, his hands trembling slightly, the golden confidence that had carried him through the entire evening finally completely gone. I don't even know what to say to you, he said quietly, looking at his brother. I've spent my whole life assuming you were fine, that you didn't care about any of this the way I did. I never once considered that maybe you cared more than I did, you just never had the chance to show it. I had the chance, Thaddeus said. I just learned a long time ago that nobody in this family was really looking. The terrace door opened one final time, and a member of the household staff appeared, looking uncertainly between the four of them. Mrs. Caldbury Ash? The guests are asking about Mr. Weston's speech. Should I tell them to wait? Or Cordelia looked at her husband, then at her two sons standing on opposite sides of a truth that had taken 23 years and one catastrophic evening to finally surface. Give us 5 more minutes, she said quietly. There's something I need to say to my son. Both of them. Before anyone gives another speech tonight. The staff member disappeared back inside, leaving the four of them alone on the terrace once more, the party's muffled laughter feeling suddenly distant, almost unreal, against the weight of what was happening just beyond its doors. Cordelia turned to face Thaddeus fully, her carefully composed exterior completely stripped away now, replaced by something Thaddeus had rarely seen from his mother in 23 years, genuine, unguarded vulnerability. I don't have an excuse, she said, her voice trembling. I could tell you it was hard, adjusting to motherhood after a difficult pregnancy with Weston. Or that some part of me always felt guilty for not being able to give your father a second biological child the way he'd hoped. But none of that excuses 23 years of making you feel like an afterthought in your own home. Her eyes filled with tears she made no effort to hide. You saved this family's company today, Thaddeus, not Weston. Not your father. You and I stood in that ballroom an hour ago and let my other son call you a mistake without saying a single word in your defense. Mom, Weston started. I'm not finished, Cordelia said, holding up a hand, though her voice carried none of its usual sharpness. I have spent this boy's entire life, she continued, gesturing toward Thaddeus, measuring his worth against yours, Weston. As though love were something finite that had to be rationed between 2 children instead of given freely to both. That was never his failure. That was mine. Thaddeus felt something shift in his chest, not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it. The beginning of a door cracking open after 23 years of being sealed shut. I don't need you to fix 23 years in 5 minutes on a terrace, he said quietly. That's not how this works. But I appreciate you saying it out loud, in front of everyone, instead of quietly hoping it would fix itself the way you usually do. Cordelia nodded, wiping her eyes carefully, mindful of her makeup even now, some habits too deeply ingrained to abandon entirely. What do you need from us then? Tell me. Whatever it is. Thaddeus considered the question for a long moment, looking between his mother, his father, and his brother, 3 people who'd spent his entire life teaching him, in ways large and small, that his place in this family was conditional, provisional, always one step removed from certainty. I need you to stop introducing us differently, he said finally. I need you to say my sons, plural, every single time, the way you should have been saying it since the day you brought me home. I need actions that match tonight's words, not just tonight's words themselves. He paused. And I need Weston to actually learn this business, not just inherit a title for it. Weston stepped forward, something humbled and sincere replacing his earlier bravado entirely. I'll do that, he said. I'll actually learn it. Properly, this time. Starting Monday. He hesitated, then added, quieter, and I want to formally ask the board to reconsider the COO structure. Not because they're forcing me out, but because I think you should be running point on the financial recovery. Not me. I'll learn under you, if you'll let me. The real way. Not the way Mom's always tried to hand things to me. It was, Thaddeus realized, the first genuinely selfless thing he'd ever heard his brother offer, unprompted, without an audience to perform for. I'd like that, Thaddeus said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. Not because I want power over you. Because maybe, for the first time, we could actually build something together instead of you being handed something I quietly protected. Reginald, silent through most of the exchange, finally spoke, his voice thick with an emotion he'd spent decades suppressing behind boardrooms and business trips. Your grandfather would be proud of you, Thaddeus, prouder than he'd ever admit out loud. He built this company from nothing, The same way you saved it from nothing today. He reached out, placing a hand on his son's shoulder, the first genuine, unguarded gesture of affection Thaddeus could remember receiving from his father in years. I'm sorry it took almost losing everything for me to finally say that. 6 months later, Caldbury Industries emerged from its financial restructuring stronger than it had been in over a decade. With Thaddeus formally appointed Chief Financial Officer, overseeing the company's recovery with the same quiet diligence he'd always brought to every problem no one else noticed. Weston, true to his word, spent those 6 months learning the business from the ground up, sitting in on earnings calls, studying quarterly reports late into the night, occasionally calling his brother at midnight with questions he would have once been too proud to ask. At the company's annual gala the following spring, Cordelia stood at the podium, champagne glass raised, addressing a ballroom far larger than the one that had hosted Weston's ill-fated promotion party the year before. To the future of Caldbury Industries, she said, her voice steady, deliberate. To my sons. Both of them. In the same sentence. No qualifier, no asterisk, no quiet distinction drawn between blood and choice. Thaddeus, standing beside Weston near the back of the room, felt his brother's hand land firmly on his shoulder, not performative, not for an audience, just steady and real. 23 years, Weston murmured, and it only took losing everything for her to finally get it right. Better late, Thaddeus said quietly, raising his own glass toward his mother, than never. If this story moved you, remember, family isn't defined by blood, and love was never meant to be measured or rationed. Like, share, and subscribe to Moments and Meanings by Anne for more stories that remind us what truly makes someone family.